honored that. Thank you. Thank you. Really honored that they could be with us. While I haven't, sadly, I haven't read their book. I've heard a lot about it, and I can't wait to find the time, to read it. It's been this pandemic year for me and for many of us has really altered my reading habits. So as you can imagine, it's altered all our lives, and we're just starting to come out of it somewhat. So I'd like to introduce first Sabeeha Rehman, and she lives in New York, in Manhattan, and there's so much to say about her. She's obviously an author and a speaker on the American Muslim experience. She wrote a memoir. It's called Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim, which received many, many awards. It received a mention, very high mention in the San Francisco Book Festival Awards, in the spiritual category, the United Methodist Women's Reading Program. It was chosen as a primary selection. She's been featured in the Wall Street Journal and other magazines and papers. And she's given more than 250 talks in nearly 100 cities on everything that she's done. She really is a major force in building bridges. I'd also like to mention something that I found just by Googling a little bit more about her. She earned her master's in healthcare administration and began a career as a hospital administrator, co-founded the Metropolitan Chapter of the National Autism Association and was its president. So I personally like to hear more about that. So would my wife, because that is also my wife, Diane's major field of interest with many, many years at Georgetown University. Walter, who I've known for decades, I can't count the number of years anymore that we've known each other, Walter. Going back to when you also lived in New York City, and I forget how many, maybe you've been living in the Washington area now for close to 2 decades, is that right? No, 10, how many years, Walter?
Six years altogether.
Only 6? It
Only
seems
6,
like a lot longer. Well, Walter has been a longtime activist in Muslim-Jewish relations. He became the Muslim-Jewish program director of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. He's worked as a journalist for more than 40 years. He's written for papers such as the Jerusalem Post, the London Jewish Chronicle, Long Island Jewish World, the Forvis, Mariv, the New York Jewish Week. You haven't written for any Arab newspapers, I see. Where's that?
Inside Arabia, if you want to quote
Inside
that.
Arabia. Okay.
That's a Washington-based, Arab paper, I guess you could say.
He's had numerous articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times, Christian Science Monitor, and many other publications. He serves as the executive director presently of Jews, Muslims, and Allies Acting Together, called Jamat. I think I'm pronouncing that right, Jamat. And I've participated in many of the activities, functions, demonstrations, yes, gatherings, rallies that he and others have organized over the past number of years. It's an incredible interfaith group based here in the Washington, D.C. area. So there's much more that can be said about both of them. And they can say more about themselves, but I would like to bring them both on, and maybe starting with, I guess, here's a question. Just given, what's been going on in the Middle East the past month, especially. So if you could maybe start your comments with with that, with what's going on there, and then move into, your how you found each other and what motivated you to write this book. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, David. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say that, David, we actually met, I believe, when I was writing an article for Moment, and I think it was 1995, if I'm not mistaken, or 96. And they wanted me to write about Jewish spiritual communities, or, New Age and Jewish Renewal, all of which was new to me. And I came down and hung out with you for a few days here, and you really taught me a huge amount. It became my Rebbe in that whole area. And so thank you. And and thank you for coming out to that Jamat demo that we did, or vigil we did in DuPont Circle just a couple of weeks ago. So I've known from 1995 till DuPont Circle, David's been there. So we wanted to start anyway with a kind of a brief a statement of what we've been feeling and about what's going on, which basically is that, like countless other thousands of others, tens of thousands, whatever it is, American Jews and Muslims, the two of us, Sabeeha and I, have been devastated and traumatized by the events of the past few weeks in Israel-Palestine. Together, we appeal for an end to the violence, for a just solution to the conflict, guaranteeing peace, security, and self-determination, very key point, for every Palestinian and every Israeli. We call on the end of all efforts to evict Palestinian families from their homes in Jerusalem and elsewhere, and sacred spaces must be respected, whether it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, repeatedly invaded by Israeli security forces, or synagogues in Lod that were burned to the ground by mobs, including Arab Israelis. So all of that we feel very strongly, but we feel maybe even most strongly that we pledge equally, we pledge as Muslims and Jews here, that we will not allow the conflict in Israel and Palestine to tear apart the alliance we built in America. We are brothers and sisters who love and respect each other and are committed to standing up for each other if either community is under attack. So we're going to redouble our efforts to fight against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all forms of bigotry, and stand together against the deadly threat in defense of democracy, and against the deadly threat of the kind of white supremacist ideology, which unfortunately has been metastasizing in America and is a dire threat to both of our communities. So ultimately, we need each other. So that's how we would start with that. And Sabeeha, do you want to sort of now start our story?
Yes, thank you, Walter. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, David, for that very gracious introduction. And thanks, Melissa, for everything you did to bring us together. I grew up in Pakistan. In those years, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan has been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and to this day, Pakistan has not recognized Israel. I always, in those days, viewed Jews through the lens of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped, all countries of the world except Israel. That is where I literally and figuratively came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, what about you?
Well, I had never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s. As a young kid, at the age of 11, I fell in love with Israel through reading the book Exodus, about the creation of the state of Israel. I believed all that very deeply. What was being sold with that presentation, and then a few months later, like a good fairy had granted my deepest wish, our family actually moved to Israel, because my father was doing a sabbatical year at the Weizmann Institute. So that was my 6th grade year. I lived there. It transformed my life, and I felt deeply, deeply at home and connected to my Jewishness in a way that I never had in the States. But I had no interactions at that time with Palestinians, either Muslims or Christians. We came back to the US, my family did, after 1 year, but I vowed that I would return to live in Israel. I felt I had to be there to be happy. Sabeeha?
So the first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to New York. My father, my newlywed husband, was a medical resident. He took me to the hospital's Christmas party. Half the medical residents were Pakistani Indian and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very welcoming to me. Are you lonely? Do you miss your family? How can we be of help? And I had difficulty reconciling my negative perception of the Jews with the positive experience that I was having. Very soon I found out that my next door neighbor who had befriended me and had taken me under her wing, showing me the ropes, was Jewish. When I was expecting a baby, my obstetrician was Jewish. When I had the baby, the pediatrician who literally preserved my sanity was Jewish. And then I ended up buying a house in an Orthodox Jewish community in Staten Island. I had no idea what I was getting into. My father was visiting from Pakistan, and he noticed and said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. They will raise their children with good values, and this is going to be good for your family, for your children. Not only was he right, but I got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to explain to my children why we don't have a Christmas tree or why we don't eat pork. How about you, Walter? What about your first contact with Muslims or Arabs?
Yeah, so I did go back to Israel at the age of 26, and I spent the next 3 years there as a potential Oleh Chadash, a new immigrant. And I was fortunate enough to get into journalism while I was there and was at the Haifa bureau of the Jerusalem Post. So I was covering the north of Israel, living in Haifa. And part of my beat was the Arab towns and villages of Galilee, or the towns and villages inhabited by the Palestinian citizens of Israel. In any case, so I met many people there, and first of all, I understood for the first time the systematic discrimination they were experiencing, had been experiencing since the beginning of the state of Israel, and unfortunately that's continued. But something else really profound happened, which was that in those encounters, they were very, very powerful, very personal, went beyond the reporter and the subject. I was invited for dinner, and people said to me, this is so important for us that you've come here as a Jew to hear our story. So I was very deeply moved by that. But when I went back to back to Haifa and talked to many of my friends, they would kind of roll their eyes and they would say, you're a nice guy, but you're a naive American. You really don't understand what's going on here, and you don't understand the Arabs. You don't know the Arabs. We know the Arabs. And I took that seriously. But on the other hand, I would ask them, well, when were you last in Fari Balin? When were you last in Nazareth? And they would tend to say, I've driven through there a couple of times. But basically, I came to understand very quickly that they had that in my few months, that less than a year I'd been in Israel, I'd had many more encounters with Arabs than personal encounters, certainly than any of them. So what that taught me was that how incredibly important the transformative power of personal encounters, and that's what so desperately needed in Israel and here and many other places to change the other from a sinister abstraction into a human being. So that became something that has guided me for the rest of my life. Sabeeha?
So the transformative power for me started happening by the sidewalk. I was a homemaker raising 2 boys. I would be standing out with my neighbors on the lawn chatting, and I guess that's where the grassroots movement sprung from. She must have invited me over for a cup of coffee, and I would have said, I'm sorry, but it's Ramadan. What's Ramadan? I must have invited her over for dinner, and our conversation would have segued into dietary restrictions. And now we're talking about, oh, so you don't eat pork either. And is kosher and halal the same thing? Very soon I realized that I would like my Jewish friends to meet my Muslim Pakistani friends, because I did not want my Jewish friends to believe that perhaps I was unique and that maybe I was not like the rest of them kind of Muslims. And I also wanted my Muslim friends to see how nice all these Jewish families are. So we would gather in my living room and chat, have dinner, and eventually those gatherings developed into larger gatherings in more larger and public spaces. Your experience, Walter?
Yeah, so I returned from Israel. I spent the next, I'd say the 80s and the 90s as a reporter for Israeli and Jewish newspapers based in New York, mostly based at the UN. I covered the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians very closely and felt I was a witness to history and felt that this was all going to end well. And then, of course, it didn't. As you know, it crashed and burned in the early 2000s, and it was a personal tragedy for me, as it was, I'm sure, for many of you. But I somehow became involved in local Muslim Jewish coalition building in New York, kind of as an alternative path, exploring an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. And then a few years later, in 2008, Rabbi Mark Schneier came along and he said, Walter, we want our foundation which has been working on relations between Jews and Blacks, Jews and Latinos, Jews and Asians. We want to work on Jews and Muslims. So I'd like to appoint you Muslim Jewish Program Director of the foundation. Would you take the job? I took it in a flash, but I had no idea really what I was going to do, because I realized I was probably the only Muslim Jewish Program Director in the world. And eventually what I figured out was what I needed to do was to become a kind of a shadchan, a matchmaker between Muslims and Jews, bringing together rabbis and imams, Muslim and Jewish organizational leaders, youth, student leaders, women leaders, et cetera, in different cities around the States, because we did this event every year called the Weekend of Twinning, where we would try to get as many Muslim Jewish twinning events in as many cities as we possibly could. So I also, and then later we expanded to Canada, we expanded to Europe. So it was quite a thing, quite a job. And I remember that oftentimes I'd be flying somewhere late at night and get into conversation with a person sitting in the next seat on the plane. And they'd say, like, what do you do for a living? And I'd say, I match Muslims, I twin Muslims and Jews. And they'd give me this look of like, what? And then when they saw I was serious, they tended to go like, oh, that must be the worst job in the world. And that happened quite a few times. And I would always say, you're so wrong. It's the best job in the world. It's given me this opportunity, this incredible opportunity to bring these people together, to bring the spiritual leaders together, and then by extensions, the communities, and it's growing and it's going really well. And it's just so, and as the people get excited when they see the commonalities in the two faith traditions. So it's been holy work for me. So I feel so privileged. Sabeeha?
That holy work had some ground rules, which was that we would focus on things that bring us together, our commonalities, and we would keep politics out of it. In fact, the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom that I belong to had this rule that for 18 months, you will not engage in politics, give time for relationships to gel and for trust to be developed. So 18 months went by and we were still not talking about it. And another 18 months went by and we felt that, oh, it's going so well, why go down that road? And this continued, except that now with this current conflict, things have changed. Now we are talking about it. We have reached a point where we feel we can talk about it and yet our relationships can still survive this discussion. Walter?
Yeah, our story was basically the same at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. We had a formula, to be slightly cynical, but it was deeply felt thing that since we didn't want to seem like we were brushing Israel-Palestine under the rug, we would often start our twinnings with a prayer by the rabbi and the imam for peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, and do that, acknowledge the situation, but then say, for the rest of this meeting, the rest of this meeting is going to be focused on how we can work together to strengthen Muslim-Jewish ties here in Washington, D.C., or here in Chicago, or wherever the meeting was taking place. And it worked pretty well, but when these Israel-Gaza wars would flare up every few years, it would cause us to get a few steps back. People didn't want to pick up the phone and call each other at those moments, right? Even rabbis and imams who've been working together would pull back, although temporarily, but sometimes temporarily would be weeks to months. And so eventually we've also come to a much more position that you do need to do more about it. And I'll talk hopefully a little later about one of the things we've done, which is to try to get to support people, Muslim Jewish groups here, to support the work of humanitarian NGOs. They're doing holy work, bringing together Palestinians, Israelis, saving lives, and so forth. But I'll hopefully talk about that a little later. So just going forward with our narrative, Sabeeha and I met in about 2010. I was calling Daisy Khan, who many of you may know at the American Association for Muslim Advancement. Sabeeha answered the phone. Sabeeha worked with Daisy. We started talking. We became friends right away. But we had no idea at that point where the relationship was going to go, where it would lead us.
So where the relationship went is that in 2016, when I was publishing my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, I realized that it would be good if I could get an endorsement by a rabbi, Walter. Now, Walter is not a rabbi, but he worked for a rabbi. So I emailed him and I asked him if Rabbi Schneier would be willing to do a blurb. Walter's response was, I have to read the book. I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday going through the manuscript, writes back to me and says, the rabbi will be happy to do a blurb. And Sabeeha, I have this idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? So Walter, why did you come up with that idea? And tell us what motivated you?
Well, two reasons. One, I thought it was a wonderful book. Spreading My Prayer Rug is a great book, that one of the best I've read in this field, and taught me a great deal about what it was like, Sabeeha's life, and what it was like to be a Pakistani Muslim woman moving to the States and going through many things that were very similar to me. It felt very similar to me as a Jew in terms of identity issues and so forth. Number one. The other reason, though, is I had been looking for a Muslim co-author for a while, because I thought, look, we're involved in this great movement, this important movement of bringing Muslims and Jews together, and yet not too many people know about it outside of the ones that do. But even in our communities, most people think that we're still at each other's throats, and that's not necessarily the case. And definitely isn't the case. There's been great movement over the last few years. I wanted to tell that story, and I also, by 2016-17, as Sabeeha and I are considering writing this book, we see what's going on in America, and we said it's so important that we write a kind of manifesto about how that as the two largest minority faith communities in America, we must stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, all of which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country. So we brought that out. Sabeeha said, let's do the book. We sat down, and pretty soon we kind of came up with 4 principles that kind of undergird all our work, and I think the work of many people who are involved in this. And so we wanted to share them briefly. You can read about them and much more, if you buy the book. But just very briefly, so we'll tell you the 4. The first one is, if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. And obviously, I, as a Jew, having covered 1 million Jewish events in my time as a journalist, I heard it almost every, it was quoted at almost every Jewish event that this is like a core principle. But I had no idea that it was in it's in the Talmud, obviously, but I had no idea it was in the Quran as well. And how did I find out it was? I was covering a Muslim event in New York about a young man, a young Muslim immigrant who had saved in 2007, who had, there was actually a group of several Orthodox Jews were being beaten by a group of skinheads on the subway. This fellow, Hassan Askari, jumped into the fray and saved them, and he was called the subway hero. He was even featured in the New York Post. So I was at a Muslim event, and they were saying that Hassan's great act of courage, exemplifies the idea that if you save one life, it's as though you save the world. So important for me, because it illuminated for me that at the heart of Islam, like Judaism, there's a commitment to mercy, compassion, justice, and the preciousness of every single life. But also, it made me realize that how little we know about each other. And I think because most Jews don't know that's in the Quran, most Muslims don't know it's in the Torah. In the Talmud. Sabeeha?
The second principle that unites us is welcome the stranger. God commands that in the Torah as well as in the Quran. My mother was a stranger in her new land. She was a refugee. In 1947, India was divided into India and Pakistan by the British. My mother made a train trip over from India to Pakistan. On the way, trains were attacked and thousands of people were massacred. she made a very dangerous journey across to Pakistan. I go into the details of the book as to how she made her escape and survived. But in her new land, she was welcomed. There she lived, there she thrived. And until her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. Now, fast forwarding to 2016, and the presidential election has taken place, we Muslims are in a state of existential threat. Can we even survive in this country? My husband gets a call from the local rabbi in our neighborhood synagogue saying that we stand in solidarity with you, and I would like to accompany you to a mosque. So my husband takes him to Friday prayers to a mosque, and as he entered, he said, "Should I remove my kippah?" "Keep it on." So they walk in. He stands shoulder to shoulder with all the Muslims offering the prayers, looking very much a Jewish person. And after the prayers were over, people walked up to him, shaking his hands and saying, "Thank you." One gentleman walked up and said, "I wish I could give you a gift, but the only thing I have on me is a family heirloom, which is very dear to me." And he held up his prayer beads and he said, "I would like you to have this." And these were the moments when I recalled Martin Luther King's words that only in darkness can you see the stars. Coincidentally, Walter's mother was also a refugee. Tell us about that, Walter.
My mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany who fled at the age of 14 across the border on foot with her mother into Belgium. Managed to get out, thinking that was only the beginning, like, of a 3-year, I don't know what it is, a journey, exodus that eventually ended in New York. But it was incredibly harrowing because the Nazis came to France, and then they were really being stymied trying to find a shelter because the U.S. had these very strict anti-Semitic quotas on immigration, so they were just being put on a long waiting list. So they took a boat from Lisbon to Lisbon, Portugal, to New York City. They arrived in 1941. I guess it was at Pesach, 1941. And basically, my grandmother was taken by HIAS, the Hebrew and Grenade Society, who you all know about, is still existing, still doing amazing work. But HIAS took my grandmother into the city to find somebody who would sign an affidavit, somebody with the same last name, saying that they were his relatives, even if that wasn't necessarily true. But they did find such a person. It took a week, and during that time, my mother was held as surety. She's a teenage girl on Ellis Island. She wasn't allowed to leave, so that make sure that her mother would come back. So then my mother lived a long and great, wonderful life in America. Loved America deeply because there was no looking back to where she came from. But she was also involved in civil rights, and she was involved in the anti-Vietnam movement because she wanted the country she loved to be the best it could be. So then if you flash forward, she passed away in 2005. And in 2018, I was asked to come and give a speech at a rally in front of the Supreme Court here in Washington and outside. And the idea was they asked me, could you tell your mother, and this was a protest or an appeal to the Supreme Court at that time, please strike down the Muslim ban that Trump has promulgated. And so I was asked to tell my mother's story and essentially to say, to exemplify how what she went through was so much like what desperate Muslim refugees from Syria, from Yemen, from Iraq, and so many places just trying to stay alive and come to freedom, and they were being stymied, and just like my mother was in 1941, all the same kinds of things. And also when people, so that was so welcome the stranger is very, very deep for Sabeeha and I. There's experiences and what they went through and how it impacted them. All that's in the book. The third principle is Islah and Tikkun Olam. Islah, an Arabic word usually translated as reform or to improve or to better the world. Obviously repairing the world, Tikkun Olam, we know that. And to me, both of these concepts, both of our faiths, to help those in society who are most in need. Very, very important. And so many of our twinning events have been involved with feeding the hungry, visiting the sick and elderly, cleaning up parks, doing many things, health fairs, bringing together Muslim and Jewish doctors and dentists and it's very, very powerful. And finally, Sabeeha, do you want to share the last one, the last principle?
So the fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. And we do talk about this in detail in the book as to how that has manifested itself in bringing the two faith communities together. But I'll share one anecdote, which means a lot to me. After the travel ban was issued, that weekend, on a cold February morning, my husband and I went to Times Square, and we found ourselves surrounded by hundreds of people holding posters into a wheelchair, into the cab, back into the square, reversing that process all over again. And she sat there protesting loudly by her silence. These people could have been any in solidarity with the Muslims. And not too long after that, the tables were reversed, and now it was time for us to stand up for our fellow Jews. Right, Walter?
Absolutely. And I just want to take all of us back to October 27th, 2018, where I'm sure many of you, like myself, kind of got up in the morning and turned on the TV and saw this horrific event happening where a neo-Nazi gunman had broken into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and gunned down 11 Jews of prayer. I'm sure for me, like many of you, it was really horrific, beyond horrific. But my feeling was, oh my God, for the first time in my life, I feel in my gut that I'm not safe as a Jew in America. So a very heavy feeling. And then just at that very, very bleak moment, I see on the TV these Pittsburgh Muslim leaders who had rushed over to the synagogue, to the Tree of Life. They were standing outside with placards and with open arms, just saying, "Tell us how we can help. We love you. We're brothers and sisters." They had worked for a long time with the Tree of Life and other synagogues. And then there was this fundraising effort that started in Pittsburgh. Within 48 hours, it became a national fundraising effort, and they raised over $200,000 in 48 hours for the Jewish community of Pittsburgh. And then finally, as I'm sure many of you remember, there were these amazing synagogue events, synagogue tributes the following Shabbat to the Tree of Life. And I happened to be at one at Temple Road of Shalom in Northern Virginia in Falls Church. And I just remember that what was so moving for me was that there were 2,000 people or so packed into that shul. And there was like sardines, but a huge, I'd say at least a third of the people were Muslim, had just come over, just showed up and were there and in solidarity with us. And I remember I started talking to a Muslim man that I was standing next to, and he had his two small children with him. It was probably about 40. The kids were 10 and 8. And I said to him, "I'm so touched you're here. I'm so moved. I can't tell you how important it is, but I just wonder whether is this okay for the kids to be hearing all this?" And he said, "When my brothers and sisters are attacked and shot, I've got to be there. I can't stay home. And it's so important that my kids are there too, to see this, to witness this. This is going to be very important for them going forward." So that was, for me, one of those moments Sabeeha talked about at the very darkest, blackest moment to have that ray of light. And that's given me strength to go forward.
Yeah, so it hasn't always been easy. One of the challenges that I have faced in interfaith dialogue is the difficulty in motivating the Muslim community members to get engaged in interfaith dialogue. I don't know what the reason is. It could be that we are a young community in terms of not having quite evolved, but it could also be that there is still this lingering lack of trust, which tells me that we have a lot more work to do if we want to come together as two faith communities. Walter, you faced some challenges as well.
Well, I have, because whenever Sabeeha says that, which I recognize, and I thank her for it. But there's been many cities that I've worked in around the country where it was the Jewish community that pulled back. So it's not always the Muslim community. Oftentimes, maybe most of the time, when we try to figure out why are people pulling back from this, including people who have already started relationships, it's really around what we call the two elephants in the room. The first one, to no surprise by now, I'm sure, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we've talked a little about how that can really set things back. And it's been, as Sabeeha said, wonderful to see this time that there has been more, been more solidarity, more joint statements, more events like we did in DuPont. We still have a way to go, and we don't want to, be too Pollyannish, but I think that's a tribute to the work that many of us have done over the last 15 years in bringing the two communities together. There's also issues around our holy books that can sometimes set the two communities against each other. And in both, we have in the Torah, we have passages that almost feel genocidal, and obviously in the oral tradition, a lot of that got worked through. But they are there, and there's parts in the Quran that are difficult for Jews, frankly, to read. That it feels that the Jews are kind of being, especially the children of Israel back in the days of the Exodus, are really roundly condemned for their disobeying God. It happens that's true in the Torah too, as my Muslim friends have. I mean, I've called imams and talked about it, and they point that out, and that's really, really true. It seems to me that my thinking about it, my discomfort was really kind of the feeling of, when I thought about it, it's like, it's okay for us to criticize ourselves, to laugh at ourselves, the very human thing, whether it's Jews, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Muslims. But if somebody else, God forbid, does that, then it's no laughing matter. So, but the main thing that I want to say out of all this is how do you deal with all this stuff? These two elephants, pick up the phone and call each other, build those relationships, and then have those conversations. And that usually helps us get through it. And that's really what it's about. Sabeeha, do you want to conclude with the lessons that we've learned over the last during our work?
8 lessons that we would like to share with you, which we do flesh out in the book, but I can just list them for you in the interest of time. The first is that we are Americans. And whereas the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts means a lot to us, we care about it deeply, we have issues here at home that need to be addressed. Democracy is at stake. We almost lost it on January 6th. We know what's happening with voter suppression. And if democracy is weakened, we faith communities, the minorities, stand to lose. So for the sake of overcoming bigotry and hatred and prejudice and preserving pluralism, we faith communities need to stand together. Number 2, speak out and stay engaged together against injustice that takes place, whether it's here or whether it's overseas. Number 3, Muslims and Jews should support the work of NGOs that are doing work on the ground in Israel and Palestine to improve the lives of the people and to save lives. Number 4, allow others to speak up, whether we agree with them or not. Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have said things that have not set well with the Jewish community, but they have as much a right to speak up as do Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin. Number 5, don't allow Israel-Palestine issue to be weaponized. We saw this happen during the Trump era, where Tlaib and Umar, because of their position on Israel, were told to go back to where you came from. Number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be allowed to speak up freely as proud Palestinian Americans. But we do disagree when Zionists are demonized. Number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with fringe groups that are anti-Zionist. Same true for the Jewish community. And finally, number 8, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic and or Islamophobic. When we criticize Israel's leaders or policies, it's just that. It's not a criticism of all Jews. And the same is true for Muslim leaders and their policies. But we do need to remain sensitive so that our statements are not misconstrued to be either Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, particularly if it was not meant to be as such. So with that, we conclude the formal part of our presentation. We thank you for making the time to come and listen to us. We barely scratched the surface, and Walter and I will hope that this will encourage you to read the book. And if you find it meaningful, please tell your friends and your loved ones about it. And spread the word. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very, very much. At this time, we'd like to, open it up and hear from, our participants along with you. I mean, we've all been on this journey together. I'm looking at the names on the screen, and most of us have been engaged, in interfaith dialogue, with Muslims, with other members of the Arab community, because it's not only about Muslims, it's about Arabs, Christian Arabs as well. It's, we've been, just in many, many ways over many years. Some 20 years ago, our community, Kolel, started a group for Jewish and Muslim teenage women called the Daughters of Abraham. We did this for about 20 years ago, where these teenagers, these young women got together to learn about each other, and also to, after several weeks of learning together, did community service together. That's one small thing that we do. We're also a community that helped to build a clinic, helped to renovate a building in, I forget the second half of Egypt, in near Ramallah. I forget the exact name of the town. We worked with Tahrir. Tahrir is the nonviolent Palestinian movement. And maybe you know the name Ali Abu Awad. Does that sound familiar? We raised most of the monies to renovate this clinic, health clinic in this Palestinian village in the West Bank. So we as a community, and many of us here have been engaged for years. So I'd like to open it up now to our attendees this evening, including members of Fabringen who I see who are here, and other communities. And our sole person from Houston, all the way from Houston, our rabbi from Houston. Please just unmute yourselves, okay? And we can kind of raise the hand. There's a certain hand that you can just light up on the screen. I think I don't see it on my screen, but feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. Okay. And how about Melissa, if you could more easily recognize people, why don't you? Victor, I see Victor's hand. Victor Granite's hand.
Yeah, thank you. You all know a new government, a new coalition is being formed in Israel, and for the first time, an Arab Islamic party looks like it will become a part of the government. I wonder if you'd comment on how important a step that appears.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely important, long time coming, but very, very important. I mean, I guess, though, that part of the story of that is that Netanyahu himself, in his desperation, was actually suddenly, after obviously all of his Arab baiting that he was doing for so many years, actually reached out to them. And then, of course, when they went with the other side, then he's saying, oh, no, that, either denying it or saying, well, this coalition has been, made too many concessions. but I mean, I was in Israel and Palestine for Project Rosanna, which is one of these groups that is working, humanitarian groups, basically bringing. This was just before the COVID crisis started, and so the Project Rosanna helps to bring sick Palestinian children to hospitals in Israel, children with cancer and in need of kidney dialysis. Anyway, at that point, and it was very moving to be part of that and see this incredible group of people, and transcending far, thousands of Israelis and Palestinians who've been working together and keeping hope alive in various ways and making a difference in terms of saving lives and improving conditions for many years. So that's all been going on. But I was struck, having not been there for a number of years, to see how much more integrated the Israeli Arab, the Palestinian citizens of Israel are now than they were, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So it seemed like it was only a matter of time. I mean, they basically were also saying, we got to get involved. We can't just, kind of boycott and it doesn't, it's not helping us. We've got it. So anyway, this is obviously, that's a huge step forward. Whether this government, which seems pretty incoherent, will survive is another question. But I guess I would say, if you ask me personally, I think it's good that, partly for the reason you mentioned, Victor, but just to stand against this demagogue who's been in there, this Trump-like demagogue, and to save, democracy in Israel. Although when I say democracy in Israel, I certainly know I want to put that in quotes, because for the Palestinians, there hasn't been democracy in decades, if ever.
And I think what my take on this was that the demands that the members of the Arab Party are making is for improving the economic conditions of the Arabs in Israel, which is something that is important to them, and it deals with lifting them up and improving their economic conditions. So that is something that I appreciated, is that they put that on the table.
Thank
you. Other questions? Just raise your hand, and either I or one of the speakers will recognize you.
Or you can also type the question into the chat.
Right.
Shul.
Hi. I don't have so much a question, just a couple of comments. First of all, thank you to both of you for writing the book and for the work that you're doing. It's incredibly important. And I think the emphasis on face-to-face encounters, personal relationships is critically important. It's transformative in a way that dialogue on the clergy level is important, but doesn't permeate much below that oftentimes. And so the more we can get out into the grassroots communities and connect communities, I think the more impact we'll have overall and in the long term. Our community here in Houston, just recently, there were 22 imams and 25 rabbis that signed a joint statement on the Middle East in the wake of the recent violence. And it was really a testament to years of work that's been done to create positive relationships, and also to contextualize the relationship in a way that brings its focus locally, and not just simply we're contentious because of the Middle East. It breaks that into a different category. Walter, I had the opportunity in Calgary to do a candle lighting one year. I think that was inspired by the foundation. And what we did was we invited imams and Muslim leaders to our Hanukkah celebration. And we had a candle lighting on the 8th day, and we had imams and religious leaders, rabbis and our religious leaders all light candles. Each one lit a different candle. And at the end, we all held up a letter that spelled out, "We refuse to be enemies," and
Wow.
it was a real powerful picture. It was in the paper and so forth. And anyway, I want to thank you for doing some of that. Just one last comment. I think one of the things that needs to happen in a very intentional way when we bring, as we did, mosques and synagogue members together for exchange visits. And I can tell you, both Jews and Muslims were incredibly impressed and their eyes opened when they went into each other's houses of worship. So, Sabeeha, as you were talking about Muslims having this kind of fear and stereotype of what Jews might be, you can imagine bringing a couple busloads of Muslims from one of the local mosques into the synagogue for the first time in their lives that they ever went into a synagogue. I mean, I can only imagine what they were thinking as they walked in, what we might be doing, or, so forth. And we were able to dispel that, to sit and have food together and so forth. So it was really very, very powerful to do. And once you get past the sort of civility and the niceties of talking with each other, then I think the real challenge, and I'll stop here, the real challenge is to increase people's religious literacy, to really know about the other, not simply just to know that the other person has a couple of children and they have a job and so forth, but really to know about each other's religious traditions. And that in part is dealing with difficult texts in our respective traditions, but also just holidays and other kinds of things that we know from our own tradition, but we don't really know about the other traditions. So I think religious literacy is really a key element here in dispelling stereotypes and prejudices. So thank you again for your good work.
Thank you, Shel. Can I just comment, Shel? Can you please send me or send us the statement signed by the 20 or so rabbis?
Sure.
So that would be so.
Would you send me an email and I'll send it back to you?
I could connect you both if you want. I mean,
yeah, please do that.
Yeah, that would
although,
be great.
how is yours to say you had a Canadian, your email may be different.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's sosachi, my last name there, @gmail.com, and anybody can.
At Gmail.
Right.
Okay.
You're all welcome to write me if you want, but
I'll definitely do that. I just wanted, just to pay tribute to the work that Shel has done. I know a bit about it. I never did get to Calgary to my. I'm sorry about that, because I just been hearing so many the wonderful we spoke though, and you did a twinning, and I mean in very innovative, beautiful ways. And I'm also have to say really impressed. I don't know if this is your influence, but one of the cities where I had a hard time getting the Jewish community engaged in Muslim Jewish, this is now 10 or more years ago, was Houston. I made a trip there and met with a board of rabbis, and they were civil, but they were clearly not, they're not going to, they were not following me at that point. So I don't know what changed, but I couldn't, when you said 25 rabbis and 22 imams, whatever, a statement on Israel-Palestine, I couldn't get them to make a statement about, tzedakah and tzedakah, I mean, it was like, so it must be quite a change.
It's been significantly, it's been due to some work of a couple key people bridging the gap, and that's been really significant. So yeah.
And Shel, when you talk about bringing busloads of people into the synagogue, it reminds me of the time when pre-COVID, we had family visiting over from Pakistan. They would come every year in the summer, and we would take them to do the usual touristy kind of stuff. They wanted to see some of the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building. We would do all that. But then my husband and I would also take them to a separate service. So we would take them to BJ, and if you're familiar with that place, there's a lot of joy in the atmosphere over there over Sabbath. And when my husband's niece was visiting and we walked into the synagogue, the gentleman standing at the door said to her, "Shalom Aleichem." And she went, "Did he say Salam Alaikum?" Then when we were sitting in the pews and she picks up this prayer book and she's looking at it, she said to me, "If I hadn't read the cover, I would have thought I was reading the Quran." And
Right.
then everybody gets up and they're going like sneaking around the sanctuary, dancing. So she went and she joined them. And later on, my Jewish friends said, let's all go out for dinner. And now they're giving her travel tips on how to make the best of her experience in New York. She spends the night, half the night, writing to her mother in Pakistan about her wonderful Jewish experience.
Yeah.
And that's just one person, but it's one person at a time. And it's someone from that part of the world who's never seen a Jew.
And I think that's what people don't realize, is that what we do in our communities has a ripple effect beyond our communities. So in a sense, we have lots of people in our respective communities that have relatives in the Middle East. And when we change attitudes here in relationships, that resonates back there as well. So it has both kinds of things. I'll tell you, it creates very interesting kinds of relationships. In Calgary, unlike in the US, there was a very serious commitment to resettling Syrian refugees. So our synagogue resettled a Syrian refugee family, which was a major, I think, statement, on behalf of the Jewish community. But what was interesting, there was an organization called Soup Sisters, which makes soup. It's women who make soup for various charitable organizations. They decided to do that for the Syrian refugee program. So a couple of them are members of my synagogue. They called me to ask, how do they get 100 pounds of halal meat? They asked a rabbi how to get halal meat. Okay. Now, you think that's funny, except for the fact that immediately I sent out an email to the imams in town, and I said, can any of you find a way to donate this? 10 minutes later, I had 100 pounds of meat, the butcher shop, and the directions, and there you have it. So,
Can we hear from other people? Can we hear
Yeah,
from
sorry.
folks around? If you just raise your hands or just let yourselves be seen or heard in some way. Any other questions? I'm listening to Shaul, right? Shaul and others. What I think is needed, there are a lot of similar organizations, around the country, where people are building bridges, similar to what Jamaat has done. Even before Jamaat, there was JIDS, the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society here in the Washington area. I think it's now 15 years old. There are other organizations around the country. On the West Coast, I can't think of all the names offhand. But it would be wonderful if there could be a book or a roadmap, a website devoted to all the different examples of how people, Muslims and Jews here, as we're talking this evening, but maybe even beyond that, have what they've done, what we've done. I don't think it exists. And we could probably get the funding for it. All right, so just put it out there.
Tremendous.
Good idea.
Well, we've tried, we put a lot of that in our book, obviously we didn't get everything in, and of course we barely scratched the surface, but we tried to paint something of a history of what's been done nationally and internationally. So we hope that some of that's there.
So if anyone else have a question? I see Aaron and Karen Primack, they've been very involved, in building bridges for years and years. I wonder if they have a question or like to contribute to the conversation in some way.
Great, wonderful program, and no, we really don't have anything to add to it, except we know that from you and Aaron and working with the music and Palestinian, every type of connection is good.
Yeah, so Aaron's referring to Heartbeat Jerusalem. My son's engaged with that, but also the Seeds of Peace program, the Seeds of Peace, camp up in Maine, and the amazing work that they've done. If every Jewish community could also find a sister community, in Palestine, in the West Bank, with Gazans. Boy, imagine how revolutionary that would be if we could build those bridges. I'm Kolel. We've sponsored 2 dual dialogue missions to Israel-Palestine, where we had Palestinian and Jewish Israeli tour guides, and it was and not other organizations I think do this, not necessarily Jewish organizations, but that's the kind of thing that needs to be promoted much more. And there's no, I don't think there's any organization, central organization that is doing it, because what you've created, Walter, and Sabeeha, what you've done is great, and it can be multiplied, but there needs to be, a much more powerful organization behind doing this. That's my feeling. And I'm running out of energy myself. Other folks who'd like to contribute to the conversation. Anyone else? Well, if not,
At the risk of speaking again, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to add one other thought here, based on an experience we had. My synagogue had a religious literacy program. It was a 6-year program in which we hired a scholar in residence from a different religion to teach us about that religion for a whole year, an entire year. So we had people, a Sikh and a Buddhist and so forth on staff to teach for a whole year. Well, the 3rd year we designated to study Islam. So our synagogue actually hired the Shia imam in town to be on our staff of the synagogue. He was the first imam ever hired by a synagogue to be on its staff, I'm sure, in history. Anyway, he taught our whole synagogue about Islam from a Shia perspective for the entire year, not a one-off lecture, but he taught the bar mitzvah kids, and he taught the seniors, and he taught from the pulpit everywhere, wrote a letter, an article every month as well. And we had a very intensive year in which he not only taught us, but built a relationship with his community. And those are the kinds of things that bring this dialogue, this connection into real time and into to have real impact upon people. And
This is amazing. I am amazed. I am amazed by.
and there are other communities that also do this. We just don't know about them. There are other communities that do this. We just need to broadcast what you're doing, Shaul, and what other communities are doing throughout the country. It would be revolutionary, if this was better known, what we were doing individually in our own communities.
Just this morning, one of my Jewish friends sent me a piece that was published on one of the Jewish publications, where in Phoenix, Arizona, there is a Muslim owner of a halal and kosher meat shop. And have you heard about it? Okay.
Great.
And it's a nice long article about the rabbis who will go over there and encourage their flock to give them the business. And during these when things got difficult in the Middle East very recently, there was a little bit of pushback from both sides. Why are you doing business with them? And the owners, they stood their ground, and that we are here to support businesses, and they are doing well. That I thought that was a sweet story.
Yeah. Along those lines, every year, right before Pesach, I go to a halal butcher, and I get the shank bone for the Seder plate from Halal. Okay, here on Rockville Pike, and we have a nice conversation, and and it's also on the Seder plate. Which should be part of everyone's Seder plate. If all Jews if you're not, unless you're a vegetarian, then you wouldn't want to have a shank bone. But to do something like that, to make a statement, at the Seder table, because we're not free unless others are free.
We sold our chametz to Mayor Nahid Nenshi, and Mayor Nenshi is an Ismaili Muslim mayor, extremely popular mayor of Calgary. He bought the Jewish community's chametz for the year.
Far
That was-
out. You got to know
Yeah.
about things.
I know.
Wow.
That got a lot of press as well. But you know, these were things designed to take and broaden people's awareness of these connections and so forth. But you know, it was a pretty amazing thought to have an Ismaili Muslim mayor buy all the chametz for the Jewish community during Passover. It was
You said hummus?
chametz. It's the
Okay.
leavened product that we're not allowed to eat or own.
Not
Oh,
hummus.
okay.
It's not hummus. Not
It's
hummus.
not hummus, okay. Okay.
Fantastic.
So he bought the chamein, which is something you're not supposed to eat.
It's leavened bread. Leavened.
Oh, the
product.
leavened bread.
Yeah,
Okay.
the leaven, all sorts of
Oh.
leavened products. So it was a legal contract he signed to buy all of it for $50,000. And when he reneged on it at the end of Pesach, it reverts back to the original owners. So you keep it in your house, but the mayor owns it for 8 days of Passover. And I said to him, I said, you didn't clear this with the legal department of the city, did you? And he said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because it was a binding contract.
Okay.
Great.
Fascinating. Very, very inspiring.
These are great stories.
Yeah. And David, I just wanted to say your son Aaron, yeah, great, has contributed so much too, and his music is so good in that the Heartbeat Jerusalem with this mix of Israeli and Palestinian musicians. It really, I mean, good, really. Remember an event at Dr. Maksud Chaudhry's, were you there that night that he performed, Aaron, and Heartbeat some years back? It's just a really memorable, really powerful. We had, you know, Muslims and Jews dancing together, and as Aaron was performing, so that was a great moment.
Thanks. Yeah. And even in the midst of the crisis in Israel-Palestine now, they, you know, these young people are still finding each other, and I think there's in the works a concert being planned of Palestinians and Jews and Israeli Jews somewhere in Israel itself. So there's a lot of hopefulness, and I think that organizations like ours here in the Washington area and the organizations that Shaul represents, there are many of us, much more than we realize, need to continue to support these efforts and to amplify our voices, because too often we hear the negativity of the voices on the other side, in the establishment, in the established Jewish, in the mainstream Jewish. I mean, I know of some rabbis cannot talk freely from their pulpits about, as I think Shaul, can't talk freely, about some of these very tough issues, and how to create dialogue within congregations, how to bring Muslims into your shul, to turn over the pulpit as some of us have done for many years, over to Muslims and Palestinians to speak on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I mean, that needs to be done increasingly, so it takes a lot of effort. But there's a lot of
just say one thing on that, David, which I think is important, is Sabeeha talked about the 8 principles, and one of them was don't allow this Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be weaponized in a way that drives us apart. And I think we've seen that happen in the last few weeks in Greater Washington, where the JCRC of Jewish Community Relations Council has strongly condemned and revoked an award they were given to a woman named Abrar Omesh. I don't know if you know that story. Have you heard about her? Who was a Muslim woman who's on the school board in Fairfax County, Virginia, and she put some things, she put on her Facebook and Twitter saying that her celebration of Eid was deeply marred by what was happening over there by the and she used tough language, which I certainly wouldn't have used, but the decision by the JCRC to really go after her in that way and say that by saying things strongly critical of the government of Israel, she was somehow disenfranchising the Jewish students of Fairfax County really was a disaster. I wrote a piece for the Washington Jewish Week, which they're allegedly going to run, but I'm getting concerned because it's been sitting there for a week or more and it hasn't run yet. But anyway, I think that's something, those kind of things. I mean, it really was very, very hurtful to the Muslim community in Virginia. And it hasn't, but unfortunately it's been kind of, nobody's sort of speaking out from our side. And so, those kind of things go both ways, but this kind of thing of repressing speech is very troublesome and dangerous.
Yep. Okay, well, listen, it's getting late. If there's anyone who has maybe something to say, please, this is your last opportunity this evening. Please, we want you also to, I think in the chat box, we have how you can order the book. Is that right? Is that there, Melissa?
Yeah,
if not,
putting it now.
It's coming up real soon.
There it is.
And also, we'll also in our newsletter that goes out to about 1,000 households. We'll also announce once again the your book and say something about how people really need to order it now before there aren't any copies left.
Right.
Inshallah.
Right.
Inshallah.
Exactly. We would hugely appreciate it. We really want to get it out there. And a lot of people have been coming to these events and saying wonderful things. So we want to see that also reflected in the book sales.
All right. Terrific. And listen, Sabeeha, if you're ever in the Washington, D.C. area, please let us know when you're coming in so we can meet in person. I mean, not just with me, but also with members of our community. Maybe we can, time it so that you can speak to us on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. It would be,
I would appreciate
people
that.
would love
like
it.
that.
People would love it. And what I missed this year personally, every year I've been going for years. I mean, I don't forget for how long, but the Muslim communities on Ramadan have invited other members of the other faith communities to come and do iftar.
Right.
And this has been one of the best things that I've done, not only for the food, but for the camaraderie, especially, and it really has helped to build, a special relationship here in the Washington area between Muslims and Jews. The Seder that Jamaat and others put together, at the Adams Center in Northern Virginia, what a fantastic event, a Passover Seder, in a mosque. My goodness, so these are the kinds of things that will build a better world.
Sure, I'd like that very much. Thank you.
Okay, shukran. Well, peace, salam, and I'd love to sing. I don't know what to say. I usually sing. I'm a singer, so
Yes, I heard.
I don't know what to sing. I don't know what could we sing? I know in English. There's plenty. Ojavo?
Oseh Shalom.
So how about Ojavo Shalom Aleinu? Ojavo Shalom Aleinu. Ojavo Shalom Aleinu.
Kulam.
Salam Aleinu v'al kol ha'olam. Salam. Shalom.
Hello.
Salam.
Shalom. Okay. Wish you all a good night, everyone, and
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
peace.
We are so grateful. Thank you.
Grateful to you guys, to you both, really.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Beautiful program.
Thank